In 1912, a railroad crew was cutting a new grade through northeast Georgia when their tools hit something in the dirt that wasn't rock. They cleared the soil back and found bone, human bone, and then more of it. By the time they stopped digging, they had 6 skeletons out of the ground, buried together in a single pit. The estimate at the time put them in the ground for well over a century, and several of them had the same damage to the neck. Nobody on that crew was looking for anything. They were building a railroad, but the people who lived in that valley knew exactly where those men were standing. A few hundred yards away, there had once been a cabin. It belonged to a woman named Nancy Hart. 6 feet tall, red hair, a face scarred by smallpox, and a temper people were still describing 80 years after she died. The Cherokee called her Wahatche, warrior woman, and her neighbors in the Georgia backcountry had been telling a story about that cabin, grandparent to grandchild, for 4 generations. This is the story of the most terrifying housewife in the history of the American Revolution, and if you think this is an exaggeration, stick around, because we are just getting started. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment with your city and state, because once you hear what happened inside that cabin, you'll understand exactly why nobody in that valley ever underestimated her again. It's 1779, deep in the Georgia backcountry. The men who ended up in that pit are Tory militia, colonists still loyal to the British Crown, and they are hunting patriots through the Broad River Valley. The war has turned this stretch of woods and farmland into something closer to a manhunt than a battlefield, and everybody on both sides knows exactly who their neighbors are fighting for. Now let's talk about who Nancy Hart really was, because you need to understand this woman before the kitchen scene makes any sense. Standing close to 6 feet tall, with red hair and a face scarred from smallpox, she was not the kind of woman anyone in 1770s Georgia would have imagined when picturing a frontier housewife. She was loud. She swore constantly. She could handle a rifle as well as any man in the county, and according to all accounts that have survived to this day, she was absolutely fearless. Her neighbors described her as a fiery woman who ran her household, and, according to most accounts, her husband as well. The local Cherokee tribe had given her a name. They called her Wahatche, warrior woman. Moreover, they had given her this name even before the revolution began. She and her husband, Benjamin, settled along the Broad River in the early 1770s, in a stretch of Georgia backcountry so fiercely patriotic that Tories nicknamed the whole county the Hornet's Nest. And when the war began, Benjamin Hart went off to fight as a lieutenant under General Elijah Clark, leaving Nancy behind with their 8 children and a farm standing defenseless on the edge of the contested region. Nancy Hart was left to fend for herself with 8 children and a farm to manage, with war closing in from all sides and the nearest help hours away on horseback. Most women in her position would have packed up their belongings and fled to safer regions further east, away from the fighting. Nancy, however, did not flee. She stayed, worked the land, kept her children fed, and somehow still found the nerve to go looking for trouble on top of everything else. What made matters even worse was that this was not a peaceful war fought on open battlefields between distant armies. In the remote regions of Georgia, this was a war where neighbor fought neighbor, where old friends suddenly chose sides, and where, at times, they even burned each other's homes because of it. Whig families and Tory families lived just a few miles apart, sometimes on opposite banks of the same creek, and everyone knew exactly which side each person had chosen. Raiding parties didn't need maps. They knew exactly which cabins to attack, because a year earlier those same houses had belonged to their neighbors, not their enemies. And in a fight like that, the line between soldier and civilian basically disappeared. Nancy Hart understood this better than anyone, and she used it to her advantage. She began disguising herself as a man. Wearing an old coat and hat, she infiltrated Tory camps and even Augusta, which was under British control, to listen, observe, memorize the positions of the troops, and then quietly passing everything back to the local militia. It was reckless, almost beyond belief, because if a neighbor happened to look a little too closely, they could recognize her immediately. And then there would be no trial, no mercy, just a rope and a tree. If you've ever wondered just how much effort went into founding this country and what kinds of sacrifices ordinary people made even before America was a nation, subscribe to this channel, because this channel is dedicated to exploring exactly that. And what you're about to hear is one of the most astonishing examples of this. On at least one one occasion, she is said to have crossed the Savannah River on nothing but a raft of 4 logs, lashed together with grapevines, just to gather intelligence that helped Patriot forces at the Battle of Kettle Creek in February of 1779. Nancy had already proven, again and again, that she would not sit quietly at home while her country fought for its life. But none of that prepared anyone for what happened the day 6 Tories walked into her kitchen. When that day came, Nancy was alone in the cottage with her daughters, and her sons were busy with chores. 6 armed men stormed in and demanded that Nancy cook a meal for them. They were confident because they had every reason to feel safe. They outnumbered her 6 to 1. She is just a woman standing over a cook fire. What threat could she possibly be? Nancy welcomes them in. She lights the fire, starts preparing the meal, and pours the whiskey. As the soldiers relax, the room fills with the aroma of cooking meat, and the men start to loosen up, laughing, drinking, bragging about the rebels they'd hunted down that week. Nancy Hart is doing something they never expected. She's watching their muskets, stacked casually against the wall by the door, and then, one at a time, she starts passing them through a gap in the log wall. There's a hole in the cabin, wide enough to slide a musket through, and on the other side, her daughter Suki is waiting. Every time the soldiers turn their attention back to the fire or the bottle, Nancy edges a little closer to the stack, slides a weapon toward the crack in the logs, and hands it through to her daughter piece by piece. This wasn't a quick plan. This is nerve held perfectly still for minutes at a time, in a room full of armed men who could turn around at any second. Nancy could have just done as she was told and gone back to her normal life once the soldiers left, but she wasn't that kind of woman. A single wrong glance, a single creaking floorboard under her foot, and the whole plan would fall apart. But she doesn't hesitate. She doesn't have a gun of her own yet. There are 8 children around this cabin, and every single second she buys by keeping her voice calm and her hands steady is a second she is gambling against her own life. She almost makes it. She gets 2 of the muskets through cleanly, but on the third, one of the Tories notices. He turns, sees what's happening, and lunges toward her. Nancy Hart doesn't hesitate. She raises the musket she's still holding and fires. The man drops dead on her cabin floor, and in the same breath, before the room can even process what just happened, she swings the weapon toward a second soldier and fires again, wounding him where he stands. 2 men are lying on the ground. The 4 who remain standing haven't even figured out what happened. Nancy Hart points the rifle at the survivors and tells them, in far more colorful language, that the next person to move will join their fallen comrade on the ground. Nobody moves. For what must have felt like an eternity, 4 grown men, trained and armed only minutes earlier, stand frozen in front of a single woman holding a musket she is clearly not afraid to use twice. Outside, her daughter has already run off to get help. Word reaches the local militia and her husband Benjamin as well. Shortly thereafter, armed patriots arrive at the cabin to find Nancy Hart still standing there, still holding 4 grown men at gunpoint, entirely on her own. Here's where the story takes its final brutal turn. The newly arrived militia want to simply shoot the remaining Tories on the spot, right there in the yard, and be done with it. But Nancy stops them. These men had surrendered to her, she said, not to them, and shooting them, in her exact words, was too good for them anyway. It's a strange, almost unsettling moment if you sit with it. A woman who had just killed a man with her own hands, in her own kitchen, was the one arguing for something slower, something more deliberate than a quick execution. So instead, the 4 remaining soldiers were marched outside and hanged from a tree not far from her cabin, in front of the same home they had walked into a few hours earlier, expecting nothing more than a free meal. A woman who was alone and unarmed when those men entered her door brought this encounter to an end by killing 1 enemy fighter, wounding a second, and personally overseeing the capture and execution of the rest. There was no army. There was no backup. There was only courage and patience. And the story didn't stay quiet. It spread through the Georgia backcountry fast, the kind of tale neighbors told each other around fires for generations. During the Civil War, more than 80 years later, a group of women in LaGrange, Georgia, even formed their own armed home defense militia and named it the Nancy Harts, choosing her as their namesake because there was simply no better symbol of a woman who refused to be defenseless. By the time Georgia carved a brand new county out of the land in 1853, there was only one name that made sense for it. They called it Hart County, and to this day, it remains the only county in the entire state of Georgia named after a woman. At a lake, a highway, a state park, and induction into the Georgia Women of Achievement almost 2 centuries later. And you start to understand just how deep this story sank into the identity of an entire region. But now here's something that almost never comes up in the way this story usually gets told. The very first time this story appeared in print was in 1825, not 1779. Nearly 50 years after the event supposedly took place, it appeared in a Georgia newspaper and in the memoirs of a man named George Gilmer. These memoirs were drawn entirely from the oral tradition passed down from generation to generation among families in the Broad River Valley. There are no diary entries written by Nancy Hart herself. She was illiterate. There are no British or Tory records confirming that a confrontation took place at her cabin. Everything we know comes from stories that people told their children for exactly 2 generations before anyone put them in writing, and those children passed them on to their own children. Even minor details vary depending on who is telling the story. Some versions say there were 5 Tories, while others state there were 6. Some say Nancy used whiskey to distract them, while others claim the secret lay solely in the meal itself and the Tories' overconfidence. This does not count as evidence against the story. It is simply the form oral history takes after being told around fireplaces for 50 years. And then, in 1912, something happened that nobody expected. Railroad workers grading a new bed near the old site of Nancy Hart's cabin in Elbert County dug into the ground and uncovered 6 human skeletons, buried together, estimated to have been there for roughly a century. Some of the remains showed signs consistent with broken neck, right where the story says 6 men were killed. Nobody can prove, with total certainty, that those bones belonged to the Tories from Nancy Hart's cabin that day. History rarely hands you an answer that clean, but for a story that lived for over 100 years purely as an oral tradition, as something grandparents swore was true and skeptics dismissed as folklore, that discovery in 1912 is about as close to a ghost reaching up out of the past and saying, "This actually happened," as history ever gets. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe, because many more stories like this will be posted on this channel in the future. Thanks for watching. You're on Palisade, the home of American history on YouTube. See you in the next one.